I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. We begin this hour at the White House, which is preparing to announce new measures in response to the death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny.
President Biden told reporters yesterday the U.S. will unveil a new major package of sanctions against Russia on Friday. President Biden has previously blamed Navalny's death on President Putin. The State Department later added the sanctions were also in response to the Ukraine war, which is now approaching the 2-year mark.
We will be announcing a major sanctions package on Friday to hold Russia accountable for Navalny's death in prison and for its actions over the course of the vicious and brutal war they have waged in Ukraine for the past 2 years. We also renew our call for Congress to pass the National Security Supplemental Funding Bill, both to enable Ukraine and its people to defend against the ongoing invasion, and also to advance U.S. national security interests.
NBC News senior White House reporter Peter Nicholas joins us now. So, Peter, what more can you tell us about this package of sanctions, and do we know what could be included in these latest measures?
Well, we know from White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan that the sanctions will be hard-hitting, striking at the Russian industrial base and the revenue sources that are important to Russia's economy. We also have some indications that the sanctions will be targeted at Russia's war-making capability, which would potentially weaken Russian forces on the battlefield against Ukraine.
Does the White House believe Navalny's death could spur Congress to pass that national security bill, which includes military aid to Ukraine that's been held up?
Yes, I think the White House is hopeful that the Navalny murder could be a catalyst for getting congressional Republicans on board here and support a package for Ukraine. Navalny's death does illustrate what's at stake in the 2-year-old war between Russia and Ukraine. Biden has said that Putin is responsible for the death of the opposition leader, demonstrating political repression in Putin's regime and showing what it would mean if an independent democracy like Ukraine were to fall under Putin's dominion.
So we're seeing this sort of debate play out with the top 2 candidates who could be up for a rematch here in 2024. We understand at a fundraising event in L.A. yesterday, President Biden criticized former President Trump for his response to Navalny's death. What did he have to say about that?
Well, Biden talked about Trump's response to Navalny's death. Trump issued a statement on social media which actually did not mention Vladimir Putin's name. So this plays into the Biden's message, which is essentially that Trump can't be trusted to stand up to Vladimir Putin, that for some reason he has some sort of admiration for Putin and other autocrats for that matter. And this shows what's at stake in the election. Biden has just framed it as an election that will decide between autocracy and democracy. And so he sees Navalny's death as playing into that and demonstrating that Trump can't even bring himself to fault Putin for the death of a prominent opposition leader.
All right, Peter Nicholas. Peter, thank you.
Now to the Middle East, where Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is pushing back against calls for a ceasefire, saying Israel would not pay any price for the return of the remaining hostages. This comes after the U.S. rejected a UN Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The United States was the only country to veto the Arab-backed proposal, saying it would have jeopardized the ongoing hostage negotiations. The U.S. has drafted a rival resolution calling for a temporary ceasefire as soon as practicable. The resolution also warns against Israel launching an offensive in Rafah. All this comes as the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is worsening, with nearly 200 babies born into war each day. For more, we are joined by NBC News foreign correspondent Molly Hunter in Jerusalem. Hi, Molly. Good morning.
Savannah, good morning. Excuse me. That's right. The U.S. vetoed that widely supported resolution yesterday, arguing that a temporary ceasefire versus an immediate ceasefire would expedite both hostage release, but also the delivery of humanitarian aid. It was widely criticized in the international community, especially in this region. But Savannah, as of this morning, critical humanitarian aid is still not reaching the people that need it most. Take a look.
Those against?
The U.S. once again standing by Israel, vetoing a widely supported UN Security Council resolution which calls for an immediate ceasefire.
Proceeding with a vote today was wishful and irresponsible.
Instead, proposing a rival draft which calls for a temporary ceasefire as part of hostage negotiations. But the diplomatic wrangling has failed to stop the war for Gaza's most vulnerable. The UN estimates there are 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza, with nearly 180 babies born every day. Our team meets 30-year-old Sama Hajjaj in Rafah. She's 8 months pregnant with no prenatal care, no vitamins, no fruits and vegetables, she says, no clean water. She's worried her baby is already seriously harmed. I'm worried, she says, I will give birth right here in a tent. It's no place for a baby. But nearby, Miriam Ahlol rocks 15-day-old Razan. Miriam walked out of the hospital just 2 hours after birth. I hoped I would die, she says. They've killed our motherhood. In the occupied West Bank, we speak with Dr. Najib Salama, who says the biggest risk is where labor starts. And with extreme shortages of antibiotics and pain medications, infections are almost inevitable.
How dangerous, in your assessment, is it to be pregnant in Gaza today?
You're going always to be concerned about your pregnancy, to provide yourself and your baby with the best medical service.
Back at the Emirati Maternity Hospital in Rafah, it doesn't stop. 4 babies to an incubator, and these are the lucky ones.
Savannah, now women told our team in Gaza some of them had not eaten in days. Some of them had not felt their babies kick in weeks. Now, Dr. Salama, who we met in Beit Jala in the occupied West Bank, also spoke about the psychological toll, the anxiety, the stress, the terror, combined with no safe place to give birth, no prenatal or postnatal care. He said it is unbelievably dangerous. He described it as a nightmare. Savannah?
All right, Molly Hunter, thank you so much.
This morning in London, lawyers representing the U.S. government are presenting their arguments in the extradition appeal hearing of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Assange is wanted by the U.S. for disclosing secret military records in 2010 and 2011, including some that exposed alleged U.S. war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. His legal team set out its case yesterday, calling the U.S. prosecution, quote, politically motivated, and saying his health and safety would be at risk if he were to be extradited. NBC News international correspondent Josh Letterman's at the High Court in London. So, Josh, day 2 of this hearing now underway. What are the arguments being made by the legal team representing the U.S. government?
Well, as you can see, Joe, the heavy rain here in London today has not kept Assange's supporters from coming out in full force outside the court. Inside the court, the U.S. government is making the argument that Assange's legal team has completely distorted the case by saying that he is simply being prosecuted for doing what journalists do every day. They say the U.S. case against Assange is going to focus on computer hacking and intrusion, how he conspired with Chelsea Manning to use passwords that did not belong her, to hack into government systems and steal classified information. He says the legal team for the U.S. says that there's no journalist who considers that a part of their work. And the U.S. is also arguing that there was irreparable harm done to Americans whose names and identities were exposed in those documents that Assange published and released several years ago.
So, Josh, let's look back to yesterday, the case brought by Assange's legal team. One of the biggest allegations they made was they have evidence of a CIA plot during Trump's presidency to kidnap or assassinate Assange. Tell us about that and just some of the other arguments that they're putting forward.
Right, and obviously it would not be part of the treaty that allows the UK to extradite someone to the US if they were going to potentially be killed by the government that is seeking their extradition. So that's why they're bringing this up. This all has to do with a report that came out about 4 years ago in Yahoo News that said that under the Trump administration, then CIA Director Mike Pompeo and the White House plotted to potentially assassinate or at least try to kidnap Assange because they were very upset about the Vault 7 disclosures about CIA computer hacking tools. Now, the CIA at the time declined to comment on those allegations, and the State Department asked about this again yesterday, also said they would not comment, Joe.
So, Josh, how long before we could get a decision here? What happens next?
Well, we don't know. It's possible that at the end of this hearing today, just a few hours from now, the judge could rule on the spot about whether this extradition could go forward. Or the judge could say, I'm going to take all of this evidence, consider it, and issue a ruling at some later date. But once that ruling comes down, if Assange is not granted a full appeal, we could see him put on a plane to the U.S., extradited to stand trial in the United States within weeks or even days, Joe.
All right. Josh Letterman in London. Josh, thank you.
Turning now to Florida and a tragic accident in Lauderdale-by-the-Sea. Officials say a girl has died and a boy was hospitalized after being trapped in a sand hole. According to witnesses, the two kids were digging a large hole when they were pulled under as the sand collapsed. Now, despite beachgoers trying to dig them out, when the fire rescue team arrived at the scene, the girl was not breathing. The boy is in stable condition at Broward General Medical Center. The sheriff's office says the investigation is ongoing.
Now to the fallout surrounding the Alabama Supreme Court ruling that says frozen embryos can be considered children under state law.
It comes after a group of patients filed wrongful death suits after another patient allegedly destroyed their frozen embryos by dropping them. Experts say the controversial ruling leaves many questions for IVF clinics and their patients.
Let's try and dig into some of those questions this morning. We have Dr. Lucky Seekon joining us on set. She's a double board certified REI and OBGYN at RMA of New York Fertility Clinic. We also have NBC News Now legal analyst Angela Senadella here as well.
That's right. Thank you both for joining us. Dr. Seekon, I'll start with you. I mean, I know that much of your work is in a fertility clinic. I'm just wondering your reaction to this, first of all. Were you surprised? What do you make of this?
I was surprised because this seemed to be like a civil matter where embryos are regarded as property, and you don't typically hear of embryos being regarded as minors or children. And my reaction was that this is problematic because we don't know how, if and how it could be applied to, how IVF is done in the state of Alabama, and we worry about the limitations that it could pose.
Let's talk about the legal stuff here. A lower court initially ruled no, a frozen embryo is not an actual person, but then the Alabama State Supreme Court says, yes, it is. What was the reasoning for the Alabama Supreme Court here, and what does this mean right now for people who want to get fertility treatment?
So even though this ruling said nothing to do with a parent's own rights over their own frozen embryos, I think that's where the biggest impact lies. Because as Dr. Seekon said, prior to this ruling, property under the eyes of the law was considered, frozen embryos were considered property under the eyes of the law. And that means that if somebody else accidentally or intentionally destroyed a frozen embryo, then you could sue for property damage. They could be prosecuted for property damage. But now, under this ruling, that property has become a human with the protections of the U.S. Constitution. That means literally your rights of what you can do with what was previously your own property have gone out the window, and they now have the rights of life, of liberty, and to be protected.
Dr. Seekon, obviously, many families have chosen to take this route. I mean, I'm personally interested in potentially freezing my eggs. I'm working on some stories on it right now. And it's a very common conversation that you start to recognize. You want to freeze your eggs if you have a partner. Do you want to freeze embryos? And you just kind of think of it as this step on the way to planning a family in the long term.
Yes.
So what does this mean for so many families and women who have taken this step? And how do you think this changes fertility treatments or conversations in doctors' offices?
Well, a lot of what we do is trying to overcome the inefficiency of human reproduction. And people who have gone through IVF and experts like myself who are very close to this know all too well that it's not a one-to-one ratio. Fertilized eggs don't always turn into a baby. A lot of eggs don't even turn into an embryo, and a lot of embryos don't have reproductive potential. And even if they're deemed to be healthy by genetic testing, many of them don't implant. So the whole purpose of IVF is it's a numbers game. You want to start off with as many as you possibly can in the hopes that you'll end up with at least one healthy embryo with reproductive potential. So the concern that a lot of patients in IVF centers in Alabama have is that if embryos are regarded as children, what does that mean? Are they going to be mandated potentially to keep them in storage indefinitely? That would drive up the cost of IVF, making it inaccessible. And will there be a tendency then to fertilize fewer eggs and drive down the success and increase the number of cycles that families need to build their families? We're trying to make IVF more accessible in our field, and this could have the opposite effect.
Absolutely.
Angela, there are people obviously who disagree with this ruling. What are their options now? Is this something that could end up before the U.S. Supreme Court, or where would this go from here?
Certainly they could petition, but the Supreme Court has a choice to either take it or not. And in this case, it's not clear that they will, because with Dobbs, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, each state now has the opportunity to determine where they believe personhood begins. And in the state of Alabama and in many others, they've determined it starts with fertilization. So at that point, states have their own jurisdiction.
So right now, this is just impacting Alabama. It wouldn't impact any other states, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Dr. Lucky Seekon, Angela Senadella, thank you both very much. Important conversation.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.